Welcome to Sheepshead Bay. We're standing in front of one of the original bungalow courts. It's an unusual urban typology with a central walkway called a pedestrian mews and small beach, what were originally beach bungalows to either side. They've now been winterized and people live in them full time. This particular part of Sheepshead was filled with these courts. There must have been 6 or 7 of them.
In a little bit, we're going to cross Emmons Avenue, which is the main drag here. And on the other side of Emmons Avenue, we worked on several of these courts where houses were damaged by Hurricane Sandy. The houses have either been raised or rebuilt, depending on the amount of damage. So those courts will look very different from here because all the houses are now about 12 feet above their original level. Welcome to Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn. We're standing in the middle of an unusual block here. Your normal Brooklyn block has houses on either side facing the street and then open space in the middle. And here we have those houses, but then inside of them is a second pair of houses that sit on either side of a secret alley that's pedestrian access only, and it's called a mews. So we have a total of 4 houses. It's a group of houses that were all damaged during Hurricane Sandy, and we've been working on them the past 5 years to rebuild them and have their homeowners return to their neighborhood.
And as part of that Build It Back program that was run by the city and financed with federal funds, we rebuilt or elevated all the houses on the mews. So instead of doing them one by one, we thought of this as a kind of urban, social, and physical infrastructure. It truly is a kind of Jane's Walk.
Okay, the first important step in the Build It Back program was to assess the damage to the houses that were here. And what we had to look at, here's the amount of damage, and you looked at it relative to the overall value of the house. And if you were below a 75% threshold, then the house was considered good enough to maintain, and we would lift it up above the floodplain. If the damage was too high, then the house would be demolished and rebuilt brand new. So on this side of the mews, we have houses that have been rebuilt, and on this side we have houses that have been lifted.
And whether it's been lifted or whether it's new, all the houses are raised to the same height above the ground, which is also the same height above the predicted flood level. And that flood level is determined by federal maps and measured over a period of 100 years.
Cliff, Brookenstein, Weber Court, Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. I grew up near where the train station is. I'm a boat person. I always have been a boat person, so one of the main draws why I like it. And Sheepshead Bay after World War II, I guess, or after the Depression, really. It was a great change made because before that, Sheepshead Bay was very shallow and spread out. After they built the bulkhead around Sheepshead Bay had become more of a location. They put in the city piers, fishing boats came. There were even people living on boats back then. more so than now, and probably because of the Depression, because they were recovering. You know, you changed really the dynamics of it. They built the Bell Parkway, which rearranged a lot. You know, it used to be lower and flatter and marshier and more of a swampy area. Oh, the boats, the type and the number of boats always change. Yeah, there's always a dramatic change. I evacuated shortly after, a little bit inland, but where I evacuated to did flood also. And then I left like right before it got bad, when I was still able to drive away. It was pretty shell-shaking because obviously there was no electricity, because I came back about like 2 in the morning, and there was still a lot of water in the court because of debris that came in. There was a tremendous amount of debris, but basically there was a ton of debris, and I kind of did like if I was recovering a sunken boat. Basically, once we heard about Build It Back, at the time I was vice president of a civic group, and a lot of the people that were on the civic group lived in the various courts, and all below grade. The civic group always tried to really narrow in on this community, the court community. So we were always looking for improvements, and so it came up at a lot of meetings, and then the city announced what it was going to do, and the federal government, and so a lot of us got involved. The only solution that really was a logical solution, elevation mostly, because if we had, a lot of us, by the time we had already done basic repairs, and when the opportunity came about doing it, a lot of us thought it was like winning a lottery kind of a thing. Climate change is really in the last few years, it's really come to the top of the table. I always believed it in a way, but not to the extreme that it's happening. The whole thing, the reason why I went along and did it and thought it was a very good idea to do it, because just in case, it wasn't high odds, but there's possibility. I lived here before, and even before Sandy, we got flooded a couple of times. It wouldn't be during a storm at a high tide, it wouldn't be totally uncommon to have seawater here. So it was it didn't take much logic to make the decision.
What we're looking at behind me is one of the elevated houses. So it was one of the original bungalows, a summer bungalow, that was winterized and became part of this permanent neighborhood over time, that wasn't sufficiently damaged to warrant a new house and has simply been elevated approximately 12 feet to its flood elevation. And the other things that are required are then, of course, a stair to get up to the floor and a series of piles, which David's going to explain.
So what's interesting to me here is what you don't see are the piles. The soil in this neighborhood is very marshy, and because of that, it's essentially impossible to use a conventional foundation. So the project used what's called a helical pile. The helical pile is a giant screw, goes down into the earth. And for these houses, the piles descend about 75 to 150 feet. So similar to an iceberg, what you see above ground is rather small compared to what's happening below ground.
And one more thing before we go look at one of the new houses, take a look at the proportions, the narrowness of the side yards to either side, the kind of proportions of the gable, the width of the house, because we're going to see something that had to be a little different this time around.
We've now moved in front of one of the new buildings that we built in the court. There's actually a group of them here. These buildings, the original buildings here, were demolished and These are brand new buildings. And because of that, they have to comply, they have to meet the current zoning rules. So these buildings are narrower than the original buildings, which means that the space on either side, the side yards, are now wider. Because the buildings are narrower, in order to accommodate the same amount of square footage that these families originally had, these buildings have 2 stories. The original buildings were just a single story. One thing we did is we set back the second story, so you still have the gable that matches the corresponding gables on the existing buildings and maintains the continuity of the courtyard space. The second story is set back. Inside, that allows the families to have a living level, and then above that a sleeping level. So I think it's slightly better functional arrangement than the original houses. A couple other changes we made. The staircases are typically either on the side or underneath the house. That leaves more space in the yard and along the Mews, which is the pedestrian access street in the middle of the block. The other thing we added, the houses have balconies, and they're basically raised porches and allow the neighbors to talk to each other when they're outside.
And that's a really important feature that David's mentioning, because the original bungalows used the Mews as their social space. They still do, and they even you can see from the open door underneath the house, have activities underneath the house that spill onto the Mews. And you see the Pertzmans gardening in front of theirs. But because the houses are slightly more remote from that Mews, having been lifted 12 feet above, the balconies also become part of that social space. On the inside of that gable also sponsors a kind of a higher space, right? Like a cathedral ceiling that adds light and air to what is really a pretty intensely programmed interior. And the 2 other things I want to bring your attention to are the variety in the roof lines. So while there's a continuity of architecture across the Mews, there are also variations that actually the homeowners helped us develop with them.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Fritstrom Pesapani. I've lived here in the court since 2011 when I first bought my home, and Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012. So I'm born and raised in Brooklyn. We originally lived in, I guess it's the Marine Park area, then we lived in Gerritsen Beach when I was a teenager, and when I was looking to buy my own home, I've always been familiar with the area. We've gone to Manhattan Beach growing up, we've gone down, Emmons Avenue for walks and stuff as a kid. So when I was looking to buy my own place, it was the feel of a smaller community, very private, close to all the restaurants and the beaches, but still in within the near my parents and my family that are still in the area. So I think what's unique about Sheepshead Bay is all the different populations that are here. There's many generations of families for years and years and years, and even with the influx of new nationalities coming in, they're still very close-knit community. People volunteer, they're involved in their community. It has a nice flair to it, very different. Pretty much you can have anything. You have the beach, you have the restaurants, and it's not so far from the city, and it's quiet still at the same time. So when the first hurricane that was here when I bought my house was Hurricane Irene, and we were actually in Italy when that one hit. So we watched that from abroad, and just watching that from abroad gave me anxiety. So when they talked about Superstorm Sandy hitting, I literally packed up everything that was important to us, and we went to my mom's house, whereas a lot of my neighbors felt to stay behind because they had evacuated for Hurricane Irene, and then they got stuck for 3 weeks where they couldn't get back here because the places that they evacuated to had so much more damage. So we chose to evacuate, and honestly, it's probably the best decision we made, because when I bought my house, it had originally been remodeled from the original layout of the home, and they took out the drop attics that they had. So we had vaulted ceilings, which was beautiful, but in the case of a hurricane, we would have had nowhere to go because we had about 4.5 feet of water, and our house was a ranch-style home, one level. The only thing that if we had stayed, the only thing where we would have been able to go in order to, not get in danger was my daughter had a loft bed. So, carrying my 70-pound pit bull up a loft stairs to get into the bed probably wouldn't have been the best idea, so we chose to evacuate. So when I first returned the next day after the hurricane had gone away, we actually couldn't even get to my house because it's like a basin where you have to walk down into the courts, and the sewers had all backed up and the sewer plant had been shut down. There was literal water still in the court. It took them probably 2 years from them before they actually because then they went the route of just elevating the homes to demolish them and rebuild majority of them. Mine, because of that cellar that was there, they didn't feel the foundation would be strong enough to hold the house if it was just elevated, so it was for safety reasons. But I mean, it's been 4.5 years from the time I left to the time I came back. So essentially I've lived out of my house longer than I've lived in it for the time that I've owned it. Myself and a few of my other neighbors, Mike Rodriguez, one of them, anytime there were community meetings, we would go and speak out and talk about the issues that were with the area prior to the hurricane, like I mentioned before with the sewage and the drainage. A lot of them lived here their whole lives. They lived here as kids, they played here, so they knew more about the history of the area than I did. But we would go and advocate for ourselves, really, to insist that this needed a whole overhaul. They needed to come in and fix the drainage problems along with not just fixing the houses and not put a Band-Aid on, but to really do something sustainable that would be long lasting. I think one of the most important accomplishments of rebuilding the neighborhood is keeping it the way that, the feel of the neighborhood, a small community, not big, huge houses and condos, but keeping it small, individual, single-family homes that people can stay and raise their family and still have that, neighborly community aspect. So my favorite part of the new house, so when the weather is nice, we just brought our furniture back up, but I usually have my coffee out here in the morning, my husband has his lunch, and if there's a nice, if it's nice out in the evening, we'll come out and sit out here. And him and the other one are out here. Anytime it's sunny out, they come and they sit. They have dog beds, I bring it out for them, so they like it. It's definitely a perk having the balcony. It couldn't have come out better.
Develop with them. And then the last point is that we're standing actually on a third type of event in this muse, and there have been houses that have been elevated, there are some that have been reconstructed, and then there's some that were destroyed by the storm that were not rebuilt at all. These empty lots are now owned by the city, but we don't know what their future will be. In the meantime, we're hoping that by the end of the summer, this will be a community garden.